Wealthy man orders his daughter to marry the chauffeur, but she teaches him a lesson. See what happened. Subscribe so you don't miss our exciting stories. Katherine Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her father's Manhattan penthouse, her fingers pressed against the cold glass as she watched the city lights flicker in the growing dusk. At 32, she had built her own successful investment firm from scratch, deliberately keeping it separate from her father's business empire. But now, everything she had worked for was at risk. "You can't be serious, Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "This isn't the 1800s. You can't just order me to marry someone." Richard Blackwood, seated behind his massive mahogany desk, didn't look up from the documents he was signing. His silver hair caught the lamplight, and his expression remained impassive, the same expression he wore when closing million-dollar deals. "I'm perfectly serious. Katherine, either you marry James within the next 3 months, or I'll make sure every client you have knows about the Maxwell incident." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. The Maxwell incident, her one mistake from 5 years ago, when she had trusted the wrong person and nearly lost a client millions. She had recovered the money, but the incident had been hushed up, buried under layers of legal documents and settlements. If it came to light now, "You'd destroy your own daughter's career just to prove a point?" she asked, turning to face him. Richard finally looked up, his steel-grey eyes meeting hers. "I'm trying to save you from yourself, Katherine. You're not getting any younger, and James is a good man. He's been our family's chauffeur for 10 years. He knows our world, and he's proven his loyalty countless times." "By spying on me for you?" Katherine's laugh was bitter. "Is that why you're so eager to have him join the family? To keep your perfect little surveillance system intact?" The truth was, James Walsh was more than just their chauffeur. Over the years, he had become Richard's right-hand man, handling sensitive matters that required absolute discretion. Katherine had always suspected he reported her movements to her father, but she had never been able to prove it. "You're being dramatic," Richard said, returning to his papers. "James cares about you. He's expressed his interest in you multiple times, and I think it's a perfect match. He has the street smarts to keep you grounded, and you have the connections to elevate his position. Together, you could take over my company when I retire." "So that's what this is really about," Katherine said softly. "You want to make sure your precious empire stays under your control, even after you step down." Richard's pen paused mid-signature. "Everything I've done has been for this family's benefit. Your mother's death left me to raise you alone, and I've done my best to ensure your future. James comes from nothing. He understands the value of wealth and power. He won't let you run wild with your idealistic notions about changing how we do business." Katherine's mind raced. She knew her father's threats weren't empty. He had the power to destroy everything she had built. But the thought of marrying James, of being trapped in a marriage arranged by her father's manipulation, made her feel physically ill. "And what does James think about this arrangement?" she asked, buying time to think. "He's already agreed," Richard said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "In fact, he's waiting downstairs to take you to dinner. I thought you two could start getting to know each other better." The casual way he announced it, as if her life wasn't being completely upended, made Katherine's blood boil. But years of boardroom negotiations had taught her to keep her emotions in check. She needed time to figure out a way out of this mess. "Fine," she said, picking up her purse from the leather armchair. "I'll have dinner with him, but don't expect me to just roll over and accept this, Dad. You taught me too well for that." Richard's smile widened. "That's my girl. Just remember, 3 months, Katherine. And if you try to run, if you try to fight this, the Maxwell incident will be the least of your worries." As Katherine walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her mind was already formulating a plan. Her father might think he held all the cards, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. She was Richard Blackwood's daughter, and she had learned from the best how to turn a bad situation to her advantage. The elevator doors opened to reveal James standing there, tall and handsome in his chauffeur's uniform, a gentle smile on his face. But Katherine saw past the smile now, saw the calculation in his dark eyes. How long had he been planning this with her father? How many of her secrets had he collected over the years, waiting for the perfect moment to cash them in? "Good evening, Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying that slight Irish lilt that had charmed so many of her father's business associates. "Shall we?" Katherine stepped into the elevator, her mind already several moves ahead. "Yes," she said, matching his smile with one of her own. "I believe we shall." As the elevator descended, Katherine knew one thing for certain. This game was far from over. And if her father and James thought she would be an easy pawn to manipulate, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The restaurant James chose was intimate and expensive, Le Bernardin, where the waiters moved like shadows and conversations were conducted in hushed tones over crystal glasses of wine. Katherine watched him over the rim of her glass, noting how comfortable he seemed in this setting now. Gone was any trace of the working-class Dublin boy her father had hired a decade ago. "You're staring, Katherine," James said, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Should I be flattered?" "I'm just trying to figure out your angle," she replied, setting down her glass. "Was this your idea or my father's?" James leaned back, his tailored suit far too expensive for a chauffeur's salary, moving smoothly with him. "Does it matter? We both know this makes sense. You need someone who understands your world but isn't caught up in the politics of it. I need, well, let's just say our arrangement would be mutually beneficial." "Mutually beneficial," Katherine repeated, tasting the words like spoiled wine. "Is that what you call blackmail these days?" His smile never wavered. "Your father mentioned you might be difficult about this, but Katherine, think about it. You're not getting any younger, and your father's patience isn't endless. The Maxwell incident—" "Stop!" Katherine cut him off, her voice sharp enough to draw glances from nearby tables. She lowered her voice. "You don't get to use that against me. You were there, James. You know what really happened." A flicker of something, guilt, concern, crossed his face before disappearing. "I know you made a mistake trusting the wrong person. I know your father helped cover it up. And I know that if it came out now, it would destroy everything you've built." Katherine studied him, really looked at him for the first time in years. James Walsh had always been attractive in that rough around-the-edges way that seemed carefully cultivated now. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His hands, once calloused from manual labor, were now manicured and smooth. He had transformed himself into exactly what her father wanted in a son-in-law. "You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you?" she asked, the realization hitting her. "All those years, driving me around, listening to my phone calls, reporting back to my father, you were just waiting for the right moment." James reached across the table, taking her hand before she could pull away. "Not everything was calculated, Katherine. I do care about you. I've watched you build your company. I've seen how brilliant you are. We could be great together." Katherine allowed her fingers to remain in his grasp, fighting the urge to recoil. "And what about love, James? Does that factor into your equation at all?" "Love?" He smiled, gentle and condescending. "We're Blackwoods, or we will be. Love is a luxury we can't afford. But we can have respect, partnership, success. Isn't that better than some romantic fantasy?" "We?" Katherine's laugh was soft and dangerous. "You're not a Blackwood yet, James. And you've made one serious mistake." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "And what's that?" "I'm not just a Blackwood. I'm my father's daughter. And you should know better than anyone what that means." She pulled her hand away and stood, smoothing her dress. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to use the ladies' room." In the elegant bathroom, Katherine pulled out her phone and made a call. "Sarah, I need you to pull everything we have on James Walsh. Everything, and I mean everything, before he came to work for my father, his time in Dublin, all of it. And Sarah, I need it tonight." Ending the call, Katherine stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was polished, professional, and every inch Richard Blackwood's heir. But unlike her father, she had learned from her mother before she died that true power came from understanding people's hearts, not just their weaknesses. Returning to the table, Katherine slid back into her seat with a warm smile. "You know what, James? You're right. We should give this a chance. In fact, why don't you come to my office tomorrow? We can discuss our future properly." James's smile widened, victory gleaming in his eyes. "I'd like that, Katherine. I really would." What he didn't see was the cold calculation behind her smile, the wheels turning in her mind. Katherine had spent years watching her father destroy competitors who underestimated him. Now it was her turn to show what she had learned. As they left the restaurant, James held the car door open for her with practiced elegance. Katherine paused before getting in, reaching up to straighten his tie. "You know, James," she said softly, "my father taught me something valuable when I was young. Would you like to know what it was?" He leaned in slightly, drawn in by her sudden warmth. "What's that?" "He taught me that the most dangerous moment in any game is when you think you've already won." She patted his chest gently and slid into the car, leaving him to close the door behind her. As they drove through the glittering Manhattan night, Katherine pulled out her phone and saw a message from Sarah. "You're going to want to see this. Found something interesting about our friend's time in Dublin. Very interesting." Katherine smiled and tucked her phone away. The game was indeed far from over. It was just beginning, and James was about to learn why crossing a Blackwood woman was even more dangerous than crossing a Blackwood man. Katherine sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor of a sleek Manhattan high-rise, the morning sun casting long shadows across her desk. The file Sarah had compiled on James Walsh lay open before her, its contents spread out like cards in a high-stakes poker game. What she'd discovered had kept her awake all night, her mind racing with possibilities. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Katherine asked Sarah, who sat across from her, tablet in hand. "Triple-checked everything," Sarah replied, her usual efficiency tinged with excitement. "James Walsh isn't just hiding something. He's hiding everything. The man who works for your father. He barely exists before 10 years ago." Katherine picked up a photograph, grainy, pulled from an old Dublin newspaper. It showed a younger James, but his name in the caption was different. Seamus Whelan. He stood outside a courthouse, his face harder, angrier than the polished chauffeur she knew. "Tell me again," Katherine said, though she'd memorized every detail. Sarah leaned forward. "Seamus Whelan was involved in a series of sophisticated investment scams in Dublin. Small stuff at first, convincing elderly people to invest in fake companies. But he got bolder. His last scheme involved convincing a wealthy widow to sign over her entire estate. He disappeared right before the police could arrest him, and somehow ended up working for my father," Katherine mused, connecting the dots. "With a new name, a new accent, one that's far more charming and less working-class Dublin, and a completely fabricated background." "The timing matches perfectly," Sarah confirmed. Seamus Whelan vanished from Dublin, and 3 months later, James Walsh appeared in New York, complete with impeccable references that we now know were forged. Katherine stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. "The question is, does my father know? Did he hire James knowing about his past? Or did James manage to con the great Richard Blackwood himself?" "There's more," Sarah said, swiping through her tablet. "Remember Angela Morrison?" Katherine turned sharply. Angela Morrison had been her father's personal assistant 5 years ago, the woman who had unexpectedly retired to Florida after working for the family for 20 years. "What about her?" "She didn't retire voluntarily. I found sealed court documents. She threatened to sue your father's company for sexual harassment. The complaint named James specifically. Your father paid her off, $2 million to disappear quietly." "Of course he did," Katherine muttered. "Can't have any scandal touching the Blackwood name." She paused, thinking. "Does James know we're looking into him?" Sarah shook her head. "We used external investigators, routed everything through shell companies. As far as anyone knows, Katherine Blackwood spent last night having dinner with her new fiancé and then went home to sleep. A knock at the door interrupted them. Catherine's assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Walsh is here for your 9 o'clock." "Perfect timing," Katherine said, gathering the files and handing them to Sarah. "Get everything ready, you know what to do." After Sarah left through the side door, Katherine settled behind her desk and pressed the intercom. "Send him in." James entered with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. He'd traded his chauffeur's uniform for an expertly tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Katherine," he said warmly, leaning down to kiss her cheek before she could avoid it. "You look lovely this morning." "Please sit." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "We have a lot to discuss." "Indeed we do," he smiled, making himself comfortable. "I took the liberty of having my lawyer draw up a prenuptial agreement. Your father reviewed it this morning and—" "Let's talk about Dublin," Katherine interrupted quietly. The change in James's expression was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable tension in his shoulders, but Katherine had been watching for it. "Dublin?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, Dublin. Beautiful city. Though I imagine it wasn't so beautiful for Seamus Whelan when he had to flee in the middle of the night, leaving behind a trail of victims and an active police investigation." James's face went completely still, the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice at hiding one's true reactions. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Katherine opened her desk drawer and removed a single photograph, sliding it across the desk. It was the courthouse photo, but this time she'd had it enhanced, cleaned up. There was no mistaking the man in it for anyone but James. "No?" she asked softly. "Perhaps we should call Mrs. O'Malley. I'm sure she'd love to know what happened to the man who convinced her to invest her life savings in a non-existent real estate development. Or maybe we should reach out to Angela Morrison. I hear Florida is lovely this time of year." James's charm fell away like a discarded mask. His eyes, previously warm and inviting, turned cold and calculating. "Whatever you think you know." "I know everything, James. Or should I call you Seamus? I know about the scams in Dublin. I know about Angela Morrison. I know every skeleton you've tried to bury." Katherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The question is, does my father know?" A muscle twitched in James's jaw. "What do you want?" "You're going to go to my father and tell him you've changed your mind, that you don't want to marry me after all, that you think it's best if you resign from your position and move on." James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And why would I do that? Even if you told your father everything, who do you think he'd believe? The daughter who's been defying him at every turn? Or the loyal employee who's been by his side for 10 years? Because if you don't," Katherine said, pressing a button on her desk phone, "in exactly 1 hour, the Irish police will receive an anonymous tip about the current whereabouts of Seamus Whelan, along with enough evidence to extradite and convict him. Simultaneously, every major financial publication in New York will receive documentation about your past and your relationship with Angela Morrison. The Blackwood name might survive the scandal. But you," she smiled coldly, "you'll be on a plane back to Dublin in handcuffs." James stood so quickly his chair nearly toppled. "You're bluffing." "Am I? You've spent 10 years watching me, James. You've seen how I build things, how I plan, how I execute. Do you really think I'd start this conversation without making absolutely sure I could finish it?" He braced his hands on her desk, leaning forward menacingly. "You have no idea what you're doing. My father taught me to always have leverage." Katherine cut him off, not backing down an inch. "But my mother taught me something more important. She taught me to recognize predators in gentlemen's clothing." She stood, matching his posture. "You have until noon to talk to my father. After that, everything goes public." "This isn't over," James snarled, his polished accent slipping for the first time, revealing the Dublin streets beneath. "Actually, it is." "Sarah?" Katherine called out. Sarah entered from the side door, holding up her phone. "Everything's recorded, Katherine, both audio and video. Should I add it to the package?" James straightened slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He was trapped, and he knew it. The carefully constructed facade he'd built over 10 years was about to crumble. and there was nothing he could do about it. "Noon, James," Katherine reminded him. "The clock's ticking." After he left, Sarah turned to Katherine. "He'll try something desperate. Men like him always do." "I'm counting on it," Katherine said, returning to her window view. "That's why we're not waiting until noon. Send everything to the Irish authorities now. And Sarah, make sure Angela Morrison knows she's about to be vindicated. I have a feeling she'll want to add her voice to the story." As Sarah left to set everything in motion, Katherine pulled out her phone and dialed a number she rarely used. "Mom," she said when the line connected, "I need your help. It's time to remind Dad about the promises he made to you before you left." The next few hours would change everything, and Katherine needed all the allies she could get. Her father was about to learn that the daughter he'd tried to control had become a force he never expected, and she was done playing by his rules. The elevator ride to her father's penthouse office felt longer than usual. Katherine watched the numbers climb, each floor bringing her closer to a confrontation that would either liberate her or destroy everything she'd built. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind from their phone conversation. "Your father made me a promise the day we separated," Eleanor Blackwood had said, her voice strong despite the years of distance. "He swore he would never force you into the same kind of arranged marriage that ruined my life. I have the document, Katherine. He signed it, had it notarized. He was so desperate to keep me quiet about his affairs that he would have signed anything." Now, armed with that knowledge and the evidence against James, Katherine prepared for battle. The doors opened directly into her father's private reception area, where his assistant Margaret looked up with surprise. "Miss Blackwood, your father is in a meeting with Mr. Walsh." "Perfect," Katherine interrupted, striding past her towards the heavy oak doors. She could hear raised voices from within. James had obviously begun his desperate attempt to salvage the situation. She pushed open the doors without knocking. The scene before her was exactly what she'd expected. James, his polished facade cracking, stood before Richard Blackwood's desk, while her father sat in his leather chair, his face darkening with anger. "How dare you barge in here?" Richard began, but Katherine cut him off. "I think you'll want to hear this, Dad." She closed the doors behind her. "James was just about to tell you who he really is. Weren't you, Seamus?" James whirled to face her, his carefully cultivated accent slipping entirely. "You promised until noon." "I lied," Katherine said simply, "something I learned from watching you all these years." She turned to her father. "Dad, meet Seamus Whelan, wanted in Ireland for multiple counts of fraud and theft. He's been living under a false identity for the past decade, working his way into your confidence while hiding a criminal past that would make even your most ruthless competitors blush." Richard's expression remained unchanged. But Katherine knew her father well enough to see the subtle signs of surprise, the slight widening of his eyes, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his armrest. "These are serious accusations, Katherine," he said carefully. "They're not accusations, they're facts, facts that are, as of 20 minutes ago, in the hands of both the Irish police and every major news outlet in New York." She pulled out her phone, showing them the breaking news alert that had just popped up. "International fraudster exposed in high society scandal." James moved with unexpected speed, grabbing Katherine's arm. "You little, take your hand off my daughter." Richard's voice cut through the room like ice. Despite everything, he was still a father, and the sight of James grabbing Katherine had shattered any remaining loyalty he might have felt. James released her immediately, stepping back. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain everything. This is all a misunderstanding." "Save it for the police," Katherine interrupted. "They're probably already in the lobby." She turned to her father. "But this isn't just about James, is it, Dad? Let's talk about why you really wanted this marriage to happen." Richard stood slowly, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the office. "Katherine, you don't understand." "Actually, I do. I understand perfectly. James has been helping you hide money, moving it through shell companies, concealing it from the IRS, from your board of directors, even from me. That's why you wanted him in the family. Once he married me, he'd be legally protected from testifying against you." The color drained from Richard's face. "How did you find out?" "I learned from the best, Dad. You taught me to always look deeper, to follow the money. So I did. And what I found," she shook her head, "the scandal of James's true identity is nothing compared to what would happen if your financial dealings came to light. James saw his opportunity and took it. Mr. Blackwood, she's bluffing. She couldn't possibly have access to those records. Only you and I." "Actually," Katherine interrupted again, "I had help. Mom says hello, by the way." Richard sank back into his chair. "Eleanor, what does your mother have to do with this?" Katherine pulled an envelope from her briefcase and placed it on his desk. "Remember the agreement you signed when she left? The one where you promised never to force me into an arranged marriage? She kept it all these years, along with copies of certain sensitive financial documents she found before she left. Documents that made her comfortable enough to walk away from the Blackwood fortune without a fight." Richard's hand shook slightly as he opened the envelope and read its contents. The great Richard Blackwood, who had built an empire through sheer force of will and ruthless determination, suddenly looked old and tired. "All these years," he murmured, "I thought I was protecting you, preparing you for the real world. By forcing me to marry a criminal? By threatening to destroy my career if I didn't comply?" Katherine's voice cracked slightly. "That's not protection, Dad, that's control." A commotion outside the office drew their attention. Through the glass walls, they could see police officers in the reception area. Margaret pointing towards the office with a trembling hand. James made one last desperate move, lunging for the private elevator. Katherine had expected this. It's why she'd called the police to both the main entrance and the private basement garage. But before the police could reach him, Richard Blackwood did something that surprised them all. "Stop!" he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of decades of authority. James froze instinctively, his hand on the elevator button. "Face this like a man, or I'll make sure you never work again, in any country, under any name." The police entered, reading James his rights as they handcuffed him. As they led him away, he turned back one last time. "Mr. Blackwood, after everything I've done for you," "What you've done," Richard cut him off, "is try to force my daughter into marriage through blackmail. Whatever else happens, I'll never forgive that." After James and the police left, father and daughter stood in silence, the weight of years of manipulation and mistrust hanging between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "The Maxwell incident," he said quietly. "You knew I was behind it, didn't you? That I set it up to have leverage over you?" Katherine nodded. "I figured it out about a year ago, the client who almost lost millions. He was one of your old friends, willing to play along to help you teach me a lesson. But you didn't expect me to find a way to save his investment at the last minute." Richard actually smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You've always been smarter than me, Katherine, just like your mother." He picked up the agreement Eleanor had kept all these years. "I never thought she'd actually use this against me. I never thought you'd become this. A woman strong enough to stand up to me, to beat me at my own game." He stood, walking to the windows that overlooked the city he'd helped build. "I owe you an apology, many apologies actually, but I don't think words will be enough." "No," Katherine agreed, "they won't be, but actions might be." She joined him at the window. "Step down, Dad. Let me take over the company properly this time. No more schemes, no more manipulation. Let me do it my way." Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying their reflections in the glass. Finally, he nodded. "Your mother would be proud of you. She's probably laughing right now, knowing you used her old evidence to outmaneuver me." "She is," Katherine confirmed. "She said to tell you she's coming to the board meeting next week. She wants to watch you announce your retirement in person." For the first time in years, Richard Blackwood laughed genuinely. "Of course she is. She always did know how to make an entrance." He turned to his daughter. "Katherine, I know I have no right to ask this, but Jai, will you ever be able to forgive me?" Katherine looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw past the powerful businessman to the flawed, aging man beneath. "I don't know, Dad, but I'm willing to try. On one condition. Name it. No more trying to control my life, no more manipulation. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be honest." Richard nodded slowly. "I can do that. It might take some time to change old habits, but I can do that." As they stood there watching the city below, Katherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced down her father's manipulation, exposed James's true identity, and taken control of her own destiny. It wasn't the end. There would be media fallout to manage, a company to restructure, and a relationship with her father to rebuild. But it was a beginning, and for the first time in years, it was a beginning on her own terms. 6 months after the confrontation in her father's office, Katherine sat in the same chair where James had once threatened her, but now she was the one behind the desk. The transition hadn't been easy, nothing worth having ever was, but the company was thriving under her leadership. The morning sun streamed through the windows as she reviewed the quarterly reports. Profits were up, but more importantly, employee satisfaction had improved dramatically since she'd implemented new policies, focusing on work-life balance and ethical business practices. A knock at her door made her look up. Her father stood there, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, in his casual sweater and slacks. Retirement suited him. "Dad," she smiled, genuinely happy to see him. "I thought you were in the Hamptons." "I was," he said, entering her office, "but I wanted to deliver this in person." He placed a thick envelope on her desk. Katherine opened it and found the original agreement her mother had used as leverage, along with all the documents Eleanor had kept as insurance against Richard's manipulation. "I don't need these anymore," Richard said quietly. "I'm trying to be better, to be the father you deserve." Katherine touched the papers gently. "Thank you, Dad. This means a lot." "Your mother was right about everything," he admitted, sitting down. "About James, about how I tried to control you, about what the company needed." He paused. "She's also right about that young man who keeps sending you flowers." Katherine glanced at the fresh bouquet on her side table. Elegant white lilies from Michael Chen, the brilliant environmental lawyer she'd met at a charity gala 2 months ago. He was everything James wasn't, honest, genuine, and completely his own person. "Mom told you about Michael?" Richard chuckled. "She didn't have to. I saw how you lit up when he spoke at last week's board meeting about our new environmental initiatives. He challenged me twice during the presentation. You know, the old me would have had him removed from the building. And the new me thinks he might be good for you, and good for the company." Richard smiled. "He reminds me of your mother, when she used to argue with me about corporate responsibility. Never backed down, never compromised her principles." Katherine felt warmth spread through her chest. Her father's approval of Michael meant something, not because she needed it, but because it showed how much he'd changed. "We're taking things slow," she said. "After everything with James, I need to be sure." "Take all the time you need." Richard stood, straightening his sweater. "I've learned my lesson about trying to rush your decisions." He walked to the door, but paused before leaving. "Oh, and Katherine, your mother and I are having dinner tonight. She thinks it's time we all sat down together as a family. Bring Michael if you'd like." After he left, Katherine picked up her phone and called her mother. "Dad just invited me to dinner. With you, both of you, together." Eleanor Blackwood's laugh was warm through the phone. "Miracles never cease. I told you he could change if someone forced him to see his mistakes." "I learned from the best," Katherine said. "Thank you, Mom, for keeping those documents, for being there when I needed you. That's what mothers do, darling. Now, about this Michael." Katherine laughed. "Katherine, you're as bad as Dad." "No, I'm worse. I actually want you to be happy, not just successful." Eleanor's voice softened. "Are you? Happy?" Katherine looked around her office at the company she now ran her way, thought about her healing relationship with her father, her closer bond with her mother, and the promising beginning with Michael. "Yes," she said, "I really am." That evening, as Katherine walked into the restaurant with Michael by her side, she saw her parents already seated together, laughing about something in a way she hadn't seen since she was a child. Her father stood as they approached, extending his hand to Michael without a trace of his old controlling nature. "Welcome to the family dinner," Richard said, and for once the word family sounded like a promise of love, not a chain of obligation. Katherine squeezed Michael's hand and sat down, surrounded by the people she loved, finally free to be herself. She had learned that true power wasn't about control or manipulation. It was about having the strength to stand up for what you believe in, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to forgive. As she looked around the table, Katherine realized that sometimes the happy endings we get aren't the ones we initially imagined. They're better because we've earned them on our own terms, and that was worth more than all the power and wealth in the world. What would you have done in Katherine's place? Would you have had the courage to stand up to your own father and risk everything for your freedom? Do you think the father truly changed, or is he just manipulating the situation in a more subtle way? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective is so valuable to this community. If this story stirred something in you, kept you on the edge of your seat, eager to know what would happen next, give it a like and subscribe. Every week we bring you stories that will make you think, feel, and maybe even change your perspective on life. And if you want to keep experiencing these intense emotions, don't miss the story on the left side of your screen. I promise it will keep you hooked until the very end, with unexpected twists you won't see coming. It's one of those stories that makes you hold your breath and leaves you thinking for days. Don't miss it. See you in the next story.